This is the bubble that swallowed the fortune of Isaac Newton, the most brilliant man of his time. He said, "I can predict the movement of the planets, but not the madness of the crowds." Even so, it fell. It lost around 20,000 pounds, more than $3 million today if even he was dragged down by collective greed. Imagine the rest of the country. This is the story of South Sea Bubble, the financial scandal that ruined fortunes, destroyed dreams, and forever marked British financial history as the first major example of a modern speculative bubble. In 1720, England saw its financial system collapse, not by bad luck, but because manipulation, political, institutional, and emotional manipulation, the same force that we still see today in tech bubbles, inflated cryptocurrencies, and markets that rise and fall as if guided by invisible forces. None of this is new. The South Sea Company was the prototype of all the bubbles that came after, from the dot-com bubble of 2008, from digital pyramids to promises of easy profit. Because, in the end, the same question always remains: who controls the game, and who is being manipulated by it? Subscribe to the channel and like this video to follow the next stories I'll be telling. Imagine early 18th century Britain breathing a sigh of relief after years of war. The city seemed hopeful, but behind this optimism lay a silent tension, the kind that always precedes major crises in the history of money. The country was indebted, weakened, and impatient. Perfect breeding ground for economic bubbles. The population sought a narrative capable of justifying risks. And when an entire society wants to believe, even warning signs become noise. Thus began the South Sea Bubble, slow, discreet, and almost imperceptible, like a rising tide before a storm. With enormous public debt, England longed for a quick solution. This collective desire paved the way for the first financial collapse of the modern era. What seemed like a brilliant opportunity would soon become a dark part of Britain's financial history. The logic is very similar to current market movements: euphoria, grandiose promises, unrealistic expectations. Today we have data, back then, rumors. But the psychology is the same, something evident in any financial documentary about major collapses. It was in this scenario, where hope and naivete mingled, that the British elite saw a chance to turn the problem into profit. Thus was born the South Sea Company, presented as a miracle solution to the national debt too brilliant to be questioned. The plan seemed simple: the company would assume the public debt in exchange for commercial monopolies in the Americas. To many, this sounded like the greatest breakthrough in the history of money. But no one stopped to analyze the logic, a common mistake in financial scandals. The truth? The South Sea Company promised more than it could deliver. But an emotionally vulnerable country doesn't want logic, it wants hope. Newspapers fueled expectations, London cafes talked of wealth, and the company's glowing rhetoric shaped what we now recognize as the first large-scale financial fraud. And what's most impressive, she knew she didn't need to deliver results. She just needed to control the narrative, and that, as any South Sea Bubble explanation shows, is exactly what she did. The support of the British elite provided the final push. When politicians, aristocrats, and even members of the court began buying shares, the public interpreted this as a sign that the tide had finally turned. And, like any classic episode of stock market bubble history, the validation of the powerful created an illusion of security. It was as if all of England had received an invitation to enter an exclusive financial haven, and nobody wanted to be left out. And it is precisely here, at this point of collective euphoria, that the silent question arises that few dared to ask at that moment: why was everyone so willing to believe? The answer, and the devastating impact of that belief, begins to take shape in the next chapter, when the seemingly brilliant plan reveals its most dangerous mechanisms. The South Sea Company didn't need tricks, it used its sophistication. He created such an elegant plan that no one dared question it. The government, suffocating under debt, embraced the proposal to exchange bonds for shares that would supposedly appreciate in value through a trade that barely existed. The elite approved. The people followed. Nobody wanted to appear ignorant. As with any economic bubble, people believed not in the numbers, but in who I believed in them. This blind trust fueled the first major financial fraud even before any explicit fraud. Self-deception did the work on its own. And while everyone was mesmerized, the government was moving the pieces behind the scenes. It wasn't just about finances. Era can. The South Sea Company didn't just grow by selling shares, it grew by buying them. Can members of parliament, lords, and ministers received incredibly cheap shares, made quick profits, and in return, promoted the company as if it were the salvation of the economy. It wasn't optimism, it was convenience. And when the elite applaud, the people follow. This is the driving force behind economic bubbles. Authority creates euphoria. Behind the scenes, insiders knew that the company's sales were almost non-existent, but they continued selling the fantasy. The public was buying into hope, the powerful bought silence. And so England entered a financial frenzy that seemed impossible to stop, the perfect fuel for the bubble to burst. If there's one point in stock market bubble history that deserves a dramatic soundtrack, it's this one. England, now entirely seduced by the promise of the South Sea Company, entered a collective state bordering on a dream or a frenzy. It was as if the country had lost touch with reality. The South Sea bubble ceased to be just an investment, it became a cultural phenomenon. And every rumor, every exaggerated story, every promise whispered on a London street corner fueled the delirium. The company's stock began to rise at a speed that would make even modern investors' eyes widen. And the higher it rose, the more people felt that they needed to get in. It wasn't about numbers anymore. It was about belonging. About status. About not being the only fool left out of the party. And this repeats itself in all economic bubbles, including the most recent ones. The feeling is always the same: if everyone is making money, I can't be the only one left behind. The most fascinating and predictable thing is that nobody knew exactly how the South Sea Company would generate so much wealth. But that didn't matter. The psychological wound had already been created. The company goes up because the company goes up. It was the perfect logic for what we now understand as the first nationwide financial fraud. And, as any serious financial documentary from that period reveals, the bigger the bubble grew, the more impossible it became to admit that it was nothing more than fantasy. The cafes, which had once been the stage for political and philosophical discussions, transformed into small, improvised stock exchanges. Men who had never bought any financial asset now discussed advanced strategies as if they were part of the intellectual elite of the empire. Even servants, cooks, sailors, people who had never seen a spare pound, were now investing their savings. The money history of that moment became a mass spectacle. And then, the height of absurdity, fictitious companies emerged, created solely to capitalize on the euphoric atmosphere. A famous advertisement stated, "A company destined to undertake a grand project, the nature of which will be revealed later." And, unbelievably, people invested. If this doesn't perfectly describe what the South Sea bubble explained represents, collective blindness driven by greed, nothing else does. This was England at the height of its euphoria. An entire country believing that wealth had ceased to be an achievement and had become destiny. A society walking in a trance, lulled by promises, manipulation, and strategic silence. And it is here, exactly here, that the narrative inevitably becomes dark, because every delusion has a breaking point. And England was about to discover that the higher you climb, the harder the fall. The euphoria of the South Sea bubble seemed endless. For about 6 months, from the beginning of 1720 until the start of summer, England lived in a kind of financial trance. The feeling was so intense that many believed the newfound prosperity was permanent, almost divine. But, as happens in all the darkest chapters of stock market bubble history, reality soon exacts its price. And in the case of the South Sea Company, the price came with brutal speed. The first sign of collapse was subtle, almost imperceptible. A small delay in a negotiation here, a nagging rumor there, things that, in isolation, would mean nothing. But money history is unforgiving. Bubbles don't burst because of one big event, they burst when small cracks refuse to disappear. And in June 1720, those cracks began to multiply. More attentive investors noticed that the company's business wasn't growing. The numbers didn't add up. The perfect narrative was beginning to crumble. When the first insiders decided to quietly sell their shares, public confidence suffered its first blow. Few realized it at the time, but the financial crisis of 1720 was already underway. And then came the fatal turning point: stocks had risen too quickly, and now there weren't enough buyers to support the inflated prices. It was like trying to hold up a castle made of smoke. In July, the stock price plummeted. In August, the ground disappeared completely. What had once seemed like the pinnacle of British financial history turned into a cruel portrait of the first modern financial fraud. And here's the most emotionally powerful point: many people not only lost money, they lost. All families who had sold entire estates to buy stocks now found themselves ruined. Merchants lost their businesses. Servants who had invested their life savings despaired. And yes, even respected figures, like Newton, saw their fortunes evaporate. A financial collapse explained during this period reveals an uncomfortable truth: collective greed doesn't just destroy fortunes, it destroys identities. Parliament, which had previously reveled in the success of the South Sea Company, was now gripped by panic. Politicians tried, in vain, to control the narrative. But it was too late. Investors rushed to sell, but there were no buyers. Bankers closed their doors. And England plunged into an eerie silence, the kind that only exists when an entire country realizes it was living a dream, and has just woken up from a nightmare. Chaos spread as quickly as the euphoria had grown. And this contrast, 6 months to inflate, weeks to collapse, is what makes the South Sea Bubble, explained to this day in any financial documentary, a cruel portrait of irrational expectations. England was faced with an unsettling silence, the kind that only exists when an entire country realizes it believed too much, and questioned too little. When silence fell over England, along with doors closing and stock markets plummeting, something deeper came to light, something that no chart from Britain's financial history can show, or human impact, because when a bubble bursts, the fall is collective, but the pain is individual. The crisis didn't just take money, it took dreams, reputations, and dignity. Once prosperous merchants became indebted. Families who believed in the future lost everything overnight. Servants, sailors, artisans, they all believed they had finally found a path to wealth, and they were all brought down together. The greed that once seemed like enthusiasm now revealed its cruelest side. Many had sold houses, land, inheritances to buy stocks that seemed guaranteed. When everything collapsed, shame silenced them. Few admitted that they had been deceived by their own ambition, a pattern present in any financial documentary about major collapses. The elite also bled. Not only in money, but in reputation. Lords and politicians tried to hide gigantic losses. Headlines exposed their mistakes. The South Sea Bubble didn't choose its victims, it destroyed both small and large, as every stock market bubble in history shows. Some had invested more than just wealth, they had invested their identity. The South Sea Company was about status, pride, belonging. And when it all crumbled, the blow was emotional. Being a victim of this first financial fraud wasn't just about losing money, it was about losing one's own image. And what perhaps hurt the most was the isolation. In a society where honor was everything, admitting failure was almost unbearable. There were fights, separations, escapes, even suicides. Tragedies that don't appear in graphs, but forever shape the history of money and economic bubbles. And it is precisely in this broken landscape where human suffering mixes with the need to find those responsible that the political narrative returns in full force. Because, after the destruction, England wanted answers. And it wanted revenge. It was time to find out who would pay for the disaster that swept across the country like a shadow. After the impact of the South Sea Bubble devastated the country, Parliament had no choice but to act. The silence that had dominated the streets now gave way to a clamor for justice. Society wanted explanations, and the government urgently needed to regain its credibility, something that had been crushed along with the stock price. That moment went down in British financial history as one of the tensest episodes of the post-crisis period, where politics, fear, and reputation intertwined in a knot impossible to ignore. The initial reaction was to mount an aggressive investigation, a special committee tasked with understanding how the bubble had been inflated so irresponsibly. And when the first reports came to light, the country realized the extent of the manipulation. It was the South Sea Bubble explained in its most brutal form: bribes, privileged access to information, secret deals, political favors, deliberate manipulation of expectations. Exactly the kind of material any modern financial documentary would explore for hours. Members of Parliament, ministers, and aristocrats began to be summoned. Many of them had profited from the artificial rise in stock prices, and now needed to justify decisions that clearly crossed the line of what was acceptable. Some pleaded ignorance. Others appealed to patriotism. Others simply panicked. Parliament, which had previously applauded the rise of the South Sea Company, now needed to decide what to do with the compromised elite. Empire finance history has many dramatic moments, but few as delicate as this one. Punishments began to appear. Lands were confiscated. Fortunes were dismantled. Politicians' actions were annulled. Some lost their jobs. England desperately needed to give a public response to show that the first financial fraud would not go unpunished. But, as money history reveals, punishing individuals does not solve the root of the problem, it only creates a momentary sense of justice. Still, at that moment, it was all the government had to offer. Meanwhile, the legal impact extended beyond political figures. The crisis accelerated the debate about more transparent financial practices. Calls emerged for regulations to prevent the recurrence of such devastating economic bubbles. Some historians even argue that the collapse of the South Sea Company was the first time the country seriously considered how to protect the public from future financial manipulation. It was a financial collapse explained not only by numbers, but by structural consequences. But, as always, not all the answers were sufficient. The crisis had left too deep a mark. England realized that the problem wasn't just an overly ambitious project, it was a combination of individual greed, institutional weakness, and a society willing to believe in the unreal. And it is at this point, where politics and economics collide, that the real question of this story arises: what have we learned from all this? And it is precisely this reflection that leads us to the most important unfolding not of politics, but of consciousness. What can this financial tragedy teach the modern investor? At first glance, the South Sea bubble looks like just an old disaster. But, looking closer, it reveals something unsettling. People in 1720 weren't very different from us. Greed, the fear of missing opportunities, and the illusion of easy money continue to shape the current money history. The first lesson is clear: when everyone is making quick money, that's the time to be skeptical. Collective euphoria is never a sign of safety. Secondly, the insiders knew that the South Sea Company was a fantasy, and yet they sold hope. Today, CEOs, reports, and influencers do the same. When someone profits from your trust, caution is protection. The third, even geniuses are not immune to emotion. Newton proved this. Intelligence doesn't immunize anyone against haste and the desire to get rich. Fourth, bubbles only exist because we want to believe in them. And that's why they keep happening. And the final lesson: real wealth doesn't come from shortcuts, it comes from consistency. Ultimately, the biggest warning from this story is simple: it's not the market that destroys dreams, it's the illusions we create about it. And it is at this point of awareness that history transforms into a mirror. When the dust finally settled, England was no longer the same. The South Sea Company would continue to exist for some time, but now is a pale shadow of what it had once promised to be. Its fall is recorded in British financial history as a permanent reminder that even the most seductive financial empires can crumble overnight. The 1720 financial crisis was not just an economic tragedy, it was a cultural scar. A deep mark on the collective imagination of a nation that believed too much in the impossible. And, like every historical wound, this one also left questions that resonate to this day. Questions about power, about manipulation, about human fragility in the face of the hope of getting rich quickly. No first financial fraud is born alone, it is born from a dangerous combination of ambition and illusion. And this combination continues to shape modern money history, from irrational extravagances to viral trends that promise to transform any ordinary person into a millionaire overnight. The South Sea Bubble Explained is not just an episode, it's a warning. The truth is that big bubbles aren't financial phenomena, they're human phenomena. They begin in the heart before they appear on charts. And they disappear from charts long before they disappear from people's lives. Empire finance history is full of examples that look different on the surface but follow the same silent script: exaggerated promises, elegant manipulation, collective euphoria, and a crash that no one believes until it happens. The South Sea Company only inaugurated this pattern on a national scale, but certainly didn't end it. And when we look back, we realize something even more intriguing: history doesn't only punish those who lose money. It also punishes those who turn a blind eye. 18th-century economists saw the bubble grow, politicians applauded, investors celebrated, but few had the courage to ask the right question at the right time. And perhaps that's why so many subsequent financial scandals seem so familiar. The lesson is not that history repeats itself, but rather that people repeat history. Ultimately, The South Sea bubble remains a kind of elegant ghost, a silent reminder that confidence is the most valuable asset in any market, and also the most fragile. It stays alive because it remains relevant. Because whenever a dazzling new promise appears, whenever a new euphoria spreads, whenever someone believes that this time it's different, the shadow of 1720 smiles discreetly, like someone who has seen that movie many times before. And it is precisely at this intersection between past and present, between the history we live and the history we insist on repeating, that the greatest paradox is revealed. History changes, but we change less than we would like to admit.